Alright, so here we see our specimen. A young human female on a planet where everybody else is simply made of blurs. And this extraterrestrial image is what has been chosen to conceptualize the self in a social world. Or in other words, we're going to be talking about ourselves and how we see ourselves and how the way other people see ourselves affects how we see ourselves and all that kind of stuff. So there are a couple of failures in our self-concept, and the self-concept is the way we see ourselves. First is the spotlight effect. It is the belief that others are paying more attention to one's appearance and behavior than they really are. This is the tendency of people to think they're the center of the universe, and so if you do something weird, you think that, other people are reacting to it. Or like if you're giving a talk and then you hear someone laugh and you assume that they're laughing at you because you are the focus of your own universe. And so, there's that effect. And then there's also the illusion of transparency. The illusion that our concealed emotions leak out and can be easily read by others. So this, you might be dropping hints, and your hints aren't actually as obvious as you think they are, because they're just not. And so there's that illusion of transparency. All right, an example of this, again, is public speaking. People get nervous about looking nervous, and this is because of the illusion of transparency, where you think your nervousness is evident when actually nobody would know that you're nervous if you didn't tell them. And so, okay, so these are some ways that our self-awareness associates with our social world, which is why this is a chapter in a class of social psychology. So our social surroundings affect our self-awareness. That includes the two things we were just talking about, the spotlight effect and the illusion of transparency. Our self-interest colors our social judgment. We're going to look at later how we have some personal biases, especially the self-serving bias. And self-concern motivates our social behavior. That's pretty self-explanatory. We're concerned with the way we are perceived by others, and so we change how we behave. And then social relationships help define ourself. So when you define yourself in a few words, those words might reflect membership with a group and other things like that. Right, self-concept is the question, who am I? So if you take some time to answer the question for me, what I first say is I am Tova, I am a Christian, I am a lover of my family, and things like that. And so then there are other questions. So are your answers more relational, collectivist, or about self, individualist? So my answer, I am Tova, was very individualist. It was very much focused on myself. And then when I say things like I am a loving family member, that is more collectivist, looking at relationships that I have with other people. So these are some important concepts as we talk about self-concepts. So there are schemas. So a schema is, as it says, a mental template by which we organize our world. For example, one of my schemas is a religious schema, where when I look at things, I'll often compare it to my knowledge of the gospel. Or when I see people engaging in certain behaviors, I wonder why on earth would they do that, because that is so weird and somewhat humiliating and not at all something I would do. And some of that comes from my schema of decency that I grew up with, and self-respect. Well, I say self-respect, other people might say other things. But anyway, so that is what a schema might be. And so then, self-schema is beliefs about self that organize and guide the processing of self-relevant information. So what do I believe about myself? Am I Like, if someone believes that they are ugly and unlovable, then that will change how they behave, and they might develop a self-fulfilling prophecy where they push people away, and so it's harder for people to express love to them. Or you might have a pleasant self-schema where you think you're intelligent and hardworking, and then that can help create that type of behavior. All right, our social self. So what determines our self-concept? So this is again looking at how society affects how we think of ourselves. So we have different roles that we play and identities that we form. So my roles are a wife. I act differently around Ben than I do around people at church, and then differently when I'm alone with Zoe. We have comparisons that we make with others. We care about how people judge us, and we also reflect the surrounding culture that we're in. And this might look a little weird. For example, like, I feel very comfortable in the church culture, and I feel comfortable in the American culture. But when Dad and I visited Ethiopia, I felt very out of place because I wasn't familiar with the culture I was surrounded by. And so that, I guess, my sense of self was a little disconnected because I didn't fit in with that culture. All right, let's get a little deeper into these things. So, new roles begin as play acting and then become reality. So it's like fake it till you make it. Yeah, it's like you might think people are faking things, but they're actually just trying out a new role, and then eventually they'll get comfortable with that role. Social comparisons, we compare ourselves with others and consider how we differ. We do tend to compare upward, which, as it says, can diminish satisfaction. So we compare, I'm doing well with this, but this person's doing so much better, and then maybe we attain that level, and then we look even higher and say, but this person is doing so much better than me in this area. And so it's not necessarily healthy, but it's something that we naturally do. All right, along with this, we have success and failure and how these can affect us. So our daily experiences cause us to have empowerment or low self-esteem. How we deal with success and failure says a lot about ourselves. I don't know if this will come up later in the presentation, but we do tend to blame our successes on ourselves and our failures on external things. And you especially see this in games that combine luck with skill. For example, if you were playing Risk and you won, you would say, yeah, this is my strategy that won me the game. Whereas if you lost, you wouldn't say, this is the strategy that lost me the game. You'd say, I had really bad rolls, or I had really poor placement and someone else was able to group up really well at the beginning. And so you see that we tend to distance ourselves from our failures. And then, all right, other people's judgments. So this is moving on a little bit. So this is known as the looking glass self, where we imagine everybody else had a mirror and you saw your reflection all around, and maybe some of those mirrors are distorted. Although the main thing about this theory is it isn't how others see us. How others see us doesn't change who we are, because we don't know exactly how they see us. But how we think others see us is what changes how we act. And so, like the example of speaking in public and then someone laughs. So you might think, oh my goodness, they're laughing and because I'm a terrible speaker, and then that might throw you off, and then you might end up making some mistakes as you're speaking. Whereas if they laugh as you're telling a joke, and then you think, oh, I'm really funny, I'm good at this, and that increases your confidence. And again, maybe that person's laughter had nothing to do with you, but how you think they see you will affect how you perceive yourself and how you act. All right, let's look at some of this. I mentioned this a little bit before with individualistic answers and collectivistic answers. So this is the concept of giving priorities to one's own goals over group goals, and defining your identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. So this encourages the development of an independent self, so you have the same self-esteem and self-concept regardless of the group you're tied with. This is very common in Western cultures, and European cultures is not so common not so prominent in Asian cultures. There are obviously, like, no culture is completely individualistic or collectivistic, but Western culture does tend to emphasize individualism. And one of the ways we've seen this has been in unique baby names, where parents are obsessed with finding a unique name for their baby so that their baby is one of a kind, and so that's a form of individualism. So collectivism is the opposite of individualism, where you give priorities to the goals of one's group and defining one's identity accordingly. So this leads to an interdependent self as opposed to an independent self. And this is more prominent in Asian, African, and Central and South American cultures. One of the examples we see in this is the matchmaking form of courtship, where a couple will accept their family's wishes over their own personal preferences. And so, yeah, that's collectivism. And with collectivism versus individualism, they have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the things emphasized in this chapter was people within an individualistic culture tend to have higher self-esteem because they build it up independent of their group. One of the common jokes in YouTube, at least YouTube that I watch, is Asians seeking their parents' approval because their parents are the leaders of their family group, and if they achieve that approval, then they've achieved self-esteem within that group, if that makes sense. Anyway, that might not be the perfect application of that, but that's an example of kind of the difference between individualistic and collectivistic. All right, culture. So this is within, collectivism versus individualism. So Richard Nisbet contends that collectivism results in different ways of thinking. Asians tend to think more in relationships than Americans, and Americans see choices as expressions of themselves. One of the ways that he showed this difference of thinking was showing a picture of a fish tank and then asking the Asians and the Americans to describe what was in the fish tank. And the Americans, what I probably would have said to was like, oh, there was a big brown fish, there was a little orange fish, there was a seashell on the bottom. And so we're like pulling out the individual parts, whereas someone from Asia the Asians said things like, oh, well, in the background there was lots of blue water, and there were a few fish in there, there were seaweed, there was sand in the bottom, there were a few rocks and seashells. So they saw more of a whole picture instead of picking out the individual things. I mean, obviously the Americans saw the whole picture too, but when asked to describe it, they focused on the individual parts of the picture rather than the picture as a whole.
What was junking the car or burning getting a car? What's that picture?
And here's what I was talking about before. So in collectivistic cultures, self-concept is context-specific rather than stable. And so and this is focusing again on self-esteem. And so their feeling of self-esteem would be less stable. And in this culture, conflict takes place between groups. And so you wouldn't necessarily have personal conflicts with people as much, but it might be like, oh, as this is just like, as a South Korean, I dislike you because you're North Korean. I don't know if that actually happens, but that's an example of group conflict. And whereas in individualistic cultures, self-esteem is more personal and less relational. So like we take time out for ourselves and we try to build that up. And then conflict takes place between individuals, such as crime and divorce. And obviously crime and divorce happen in Asian cultures as well. That's an example of how they're becoming more individualistic. And then crime it happens everywhere. And crime can take place between groups. Like, we have like mobs and gangs and stuff like that. Anyway, yeah, but those are some examples that the book gives. All right, self-knowledge. So how well do we know ourselves? So there is a planning fallacy that occurs frequently where we underestimate how long it will take to complete a task. This is common in homework and even in jobs where you have to give an estimation of how long it'll take you to finish a project. It almost always takes longer than you say it will take. And so that is a good thing. When you're planning, assume it'll take longer than you think it's going to take. Yeah. And this is due to a couple things. We misremember how long it took us in the past to do it, and we overestimate our improved ability. Yeah. All right. We are also pretty bad at predicting our feelings. So there's affective forecasting, which says we have difficulty predicting the intensity and duration of our future emotions. And so there are two components of affective forecasting. One is impact bias, where we overestimate the impact of emotion-causing events. So for example, we'd say, oh, I'd be devastated if you moved away and then I never see you again, and I'd be so sad forever, when actually you wouldn't be so sad forever. You might be sad for a minute, but yeah. And this goes with happiness too, like, oh my goodness, I'll be so happy when I finally graduate and it'll just be one long party. Where actually I'll probably be happy for maybe a day and then life will go back to normal. So that's impact bias. And then immune neglect is when people neglect the tendency to neglect the speed and strength of the psychological immune system, which enables emotional recovery and resilience after bad things happen. So when bad things happen, we're able to adapt to that. And we can, move on with life. So when people die and when we lose our job or when a war happens and we're relocated to another country, those are all terrible things. But people have shown remarkable resilience, and part of that is our psychological immune system, which people tend to underestimate. All right, so the dual attitude says automatic implicit attitudes, regarding someone or something often differ from our consciously controlled explicit attitudes. So this is the subject of a book called Blink, where it talks about our implicit judgments or snap judgments that we make, and how those might be different from our expressed opinions. One of the main points in Blink is that some people are subconsciously racist, even though they might profess otherwise. So it's the nature and motivating power of self-esteem. Our overall self-evaluation or our sense of self-worth is our self-esteem. Specific self-perceptions have some influence of the way we see ourselves, and feedback is best when it is true and specific. So when you are giving feedback to someone or when you are praising someone, it is good, to not over-exaggerate because that can lead to two things that it might cover later. Yeah, I'll cover it later. But yeah, keep it true and keep it specific. So if a child is well in a soccer game, you can say, oh, wow, you did a really good job trying to score goals. And I can see that you've been working hard on that. And so that doesn't say, you're an incredible soccer player and you're gonna win the World Cup someday. You gave feedback that was true and specific, and that has been found to be the best type of feedback that actually increases people's self-esteem. All right, so our self-esteem. We have self-esteem maintenance. We have self-esteem threats, which occur among friends. So when our friends are successful, that is more threatening than when strangers are successful. Unfortunately, sometimes it can be hard to be happy for friends when they're successful because it threatens our own feelings of self-worth. But we are able to maintain that somehow. There is the terror management theory, which says humans must find ways to manage their fear of death. And so we manage that fear of death by trying to create some impact on the world. So we feel like some part of us will live on. And so that is one theory, that our self-esteem, it might be hinged on our success because we feel we must be successful in order to leave a legacy behind. And so that is that theory. All right, narcissism. Let's look at when self-esteem is taken to the extreme. So Delroy and Williams placed it in the dark triad of negative traits. So if you have narcissism and a lack of empathy and something else, then you have the dark triad and you're probably going to be a bad person. But narcissism can occur. So we talked earlier about feedback. And so when feedback is excessive and untrue, a person might become narcissistic, where they think very highly of themselves to the point that it's not based on evidence, and they are threatened whenever they receive critique, and they feel not only that they're amazing, but that they're better than everybody else. And so that is narcissism. All right, and then we have self-efficacy, which is a good thing. Self-efficacy, well, it's a good thing if we have a lot of it. It is how competent we feel on a task. It leads us to set challenging goals and to persist. So this is an example. When you give feedback, it should be focused on the effort and not necessarily on the characteristics of a person. Because I don't know if we'll go over this, but there's self-sabotaging or self-handicapping. And that can occur when someone feels like too much expectation has been placed on them. And so they self-sabotage in order to lower those expectations. But if the praise or expectation is based on the effort rather than the results, then that helps to mitigate or cancel out the urge to self-sabotage. And so self-efficacy is a great thing to have and is something that we should encourage. All right, self-serving bias is the tendency to perceive ourselves favorably. We do this to explain positive and negative events. So here are some self-serving attributions. There is the tendency to attribute positive outcomes to oneself and then negative outcomes to other factors, which is something I talked about earlier. This can contribute to marital discord, worker dissatisfaction, and bargaining impasses. So one of the examples it gives in the textbook is one of the authors, he and his wife would throughout the day throw laundry near the laundry basket and not necessarily in it. And then in the morning, one of them would pick up the laundry around the laundry basket and actually put it in. And one day his wife asked him if he could take more responsibility in doing that chore. And he said, I already do it like 75% of the time. How often do you think you do it? And she said, well, I feel like I do it 75% of the time. And the reason they had this misperception is because they noticed for example, the author, he noticed every time he put it in, but he didn't necessarily notice every time he forgot to put it in, or every time his wife put it in. So that was an example where he noticed more what he did.
It's more for computers.
All right, can we all be better than average? So people see themselves as better than average, and especially in these following dimensions. When a measurement is subjective, if it is socially desirable, and if there are common dimensions. And so an example of this would be, person might say, like, are you a logical thinker? They say, oh yeah, I'm a logical thinker. But then if they were asked, would you want to take a math test? And I'd say, oh no, I don't want to do that. So saying you're a logical thinker, that's something that's desirable. You want to be a logical thinker. And it's also subjective. You can't really measure that in the general way. You can do specific measurements, but then I don't really understand what it means by common dimensions. That's something I'll have to review. But yeah, so those are, but people tend, to see themselves as better than average on most things. Oh, like this. We think we're ethical, we think we're competent, we have good virtues, we're intelligent, we have good parental support, we have good health, we're attractive, we're good at, and we're good at driving. That was a funny thing. They had a study that looked at how good people thought they were at driving. And even if they'd been in multiple accidents, they still thought they were a pretty good driver. And just like I think I'm a pretty good driver, even though some people think otherwise. Anyway, so there's unrealistic optimism, which is on the rise. So illusory optimism increases our vulnerability. Illusory optimism is optimism that is based on nothing. So like if you don't study at all, but then someone tells you, oh, it's okay, I'm sure you'll pass the test. That is optimism that is based on nothing. It's not based on hard work or on study or on, it might be based on natural ability, but other than that, it increases our vulnerability to failure, and then that might lead to lower self-esteem. And so there's defensive pessimism, which is an adaptive value, which means it's a value that can help us throughout life. It's the value of anticipating problems and harnessing one's anxiety to motivate effective action. So when you see a problem, you find a way to get around it, and it's like the Boy Scout motto, be prepared, and that's defensive pessimism. All right, a couple other false things that we see. So we talked about the spotlight effect and the illusion of transparency. So these are some that are related to self-serving bias. There's the false consensus effect, which is the tendency to overestimate the commonality of one's opinions and one's desirable or unsuccessful behaviors. Okay, so we assume that everybody shares our opinion. Like, like that studio C, where it's like a girl is bringing her boyfriend home for the first time or something, and then he talks about how much he loves Benedict Cumberbatch, and he just assumes that everybody else at the table also loves Benedict Cumberbatch, but the mother at the table hates Benedict Cumberbatch or something, and so she's like, oh, how dare you talk about him, and she assumes that everybody is on her side where they hate him, and then the family becomes split because it's obviously a very important issue. And you also think this about your own undesirable or unsuccessful behaviors. So like if driving, like say, like with speeding, we speed and we assume everybody else speeds, and in that case it is probably true that everybody else speeds, and we can see that, but we might assume that of other behaviors. Like some people might yell at their kids, and they're like, oh, everybody yells at their kids, and it might do that. A lot of people yell at their kids, but not everybody does. Anyway, so that's the false consensus effect. And then on the flip side, we have the false uniqueness effect, where we underestimate the commonality of our desirable or successful behaviors. So if we are good at typing. Like, oh, I'm so amazing at typing, I'm just a computer person, where it might be an average skill. And so, but you might overestimate your ability and the the uniqueness of that ability. All right, so how does this bias happen? Self-serving bias is a byproduct of how we process and remember information about ourselves. And so the premise of that theory is that we collect data and we have the most data on ourselves. And so that leads to a bias, because that's where we get most of our information, is from ourselves and our own experience. Self-serving bias may be adaptive. It can help protect people from depression and lead to greater self-esteem. If you think you're unique and special, then that's always a good thing, right? And it can also be maladaptive, or leads to group serving bias, or other words, prejudice against other people. All right, so how do people manage their self-presentation? So this is moving on. Oh, look at that, it's self-handicap. That's what we were talking about before. Okay, wanting to present a desired image both to an external audience and to an internal audience. We want to be good for other people, and we also want to think well of ourselves. So self-handicapping, we protect our own self-image with behaviors that create a handy excuse for later failure. This is one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier, where you do something badly on purpose to lower expectations, and also it creates a handy excuse. So you purposefully don't study for a test, and then you get a low grade, and you can say, oh, I'm still a smart person, and I still know the material, I just didn't study for it, and that's why I did poorly on the test. We also have impression management, where we act like social chameleons. So if we're in a group of people that are very happy, maybe it's a party, then we're going to be more outgoing and expressive. Whereas if we're at a funeral, then where everybody's more somber, we'll naturally tone it down a little bit to match the situation. And obviously this doesn't always happen, people don't always do this, but this is generally the urge that people have, is to be a social chameleon. All right, self-control. So people have self-control, and there's effortful. Oh, that's the end. All right, so self-control. Theories have, or research has shown that self-control is like a muscle, where you can exert it, but after a while, it'll get harder and harder. And they found that people actually feel physical exhaustion from exerting self-control. Because it is like a muscle, you can make it stronger. And so they suggest making small changes in specific areas of your life and increasing your self-control in that. And as your self-control builds in that small area, it'll spill over to other areas of your life. And so, like, one of the things it suggests is not to make a long list of New Year's resolutions, but make one New Year's resolution that affects your self-control and increases your self-control, and then that'll pour over to the other aspects of your life that you also want to improve. All right, and that is a basic introduction to your self-concept in a social world.